Hello and welcome to session 7 of Doubting Climate Change, the role of public relations and media in creating doubt about the science behind climate change. So in this session we're going to look about how doubt is created within the media sphere to challenge the science that's created around a lot of different issues. And that's based on the work that was done by Hill and Knowlton in the 1950s in creating what's known as the tobacco playbook. And the prime tactic that they rely on is creating doubt around scientific evidence. So to illustrate that, we're going to be looking at social media. And I've just put here a graph that shows that in 2024, how many people on the planet are accessing or actively using social media platforms. So we can see that Facebook has got 3.05 billion users, which is about 50% of the planet's population. So YouTube around 2.5 billion, Instagram around 2 billion, TikTok around 1.56 billion, etc., etc., etc. So these are quite staggering figures in terms of communication and how narratives get into the public domain and how they get discussed. And it's a complete sea change from where we were 15 years ago before social media arrived, because then people relied on traditional forms of media. So the landscape has changed, and within that landscape, things changing, new social trends happen. And so one of the most disturbing things around social media, the rise of social media, is the amount of youth who use it and the consequences of that. And there's a lot of data around these issues from around the country. And not all of it's conclusive, but it is reasonably indicative that social media use, particularly on young children, has a negative impact on their development and on their self-esteem. And that seems to be particularly evident amongst teenage girls. And there's been a rise in the number of suicides amongst teenage girls around the world that has been ascribed to social media. Now, we can say that there's a correlation between the two, but we can't say for certain that there's causation, because the research is ongoing in that. But what we can say is that people are rightly concerned about the rise of social media and the use of it by children. And so parents everywhere in the world have seen the effects of social media on their children, the largely negative effects, and governments are having to respond. The governments around the world are being forced to respond to this, which is difficult given the fact that the majority of social media companies are based in one of two countries, either in the United States or in China. And then one has to look at the regulatory frameworks within those countries to understand what restrictions can be put on social media to some extent. Although there have been challenges to this, we saw earlier this year that Twitter was banned, or X as it's now known, was banned from Brazil for a short while. And so governments are trying to understand how to engage with social media. In Canada, the government of Canada in, I think, February this year, introduced legislation to combat harmful content online, including sexual exploitation of children. So we see different countries doing different things to try to rein in, if you will, the lack of concern that the social media companies, the large social media companies, have for the welfare of citizens, particularly of youth. And so this is a document that was produced by the US Surgeon General. We can see here at the bottom of the page that's talking about social media and youth mental health, that up to 95% of children aged between 13 and 7 report that they're using social media platforms, and that they're using them almost constantly. So they're on them all the time. The amount of hours they spend every day accessing social media platforms is pretty much every hour that they're awake. And one of the conclusions was that it's critical that independent research works with government and works with the social media platforms to understand what's happening and what can be done about it in the future. And because the social media companies are earning so much revenue from all of this interaction, and they're getting so many data points from all the interactions that youth have with the social media platforms, that adds value because they can convert those data points into dollars in terms of advertising revenue, in terms of other forms of revenue. They're very reluctant to do anything that's going to restrict access to their platforms. So one of the growing concerns is that social media can expose children to content that presents risks or harm. And there's so much evidence of this in the world. And social media use can be excessive and problematic for some children. Maybe not all children, but for some children. And again, the research is ongoing into what the actual harms can be. So governments rightly have concerns around this. And just last week, so we're in the first week in December 2024, just last week in Australia, they passed legislation that bans any person under 16 years of age accessing any social media platforms. So the government has got to the end of its patience in trying to discuss with social media platforms and the companies that control them about what to do about this epidemic and the influence that it's having on children, and they've just decided to ban it. There's a lot of discussion around the ban and how the practicalities of it are going to work, but it's actually doing something, and government has realized they have to do something. So this happened last week, and this week in Canada, the legislators are looking at what's happened in Australia and saying, is this a solution for Canada? Is this something that we can do in Canada? So in and of itself, it's not relatively a large thing. It's one country, Australia. It's a fairly large country, but the population's fairly small, banning access to these platforms. So just for its youth. So relative to the 3 billion users that Facebook has, it's nothing. It's of no real consequence to them. But the message that it sends, that government is getting prepared to take on the large platforms, is really sending shockwaves through the social media companies, predominantly in the United States. And so what is interesting is to see the fallout from that. So as I say, government is finally doing something. It's reacting to parents and parental concerns, putting pressure on big tech. And even though it's not perfect, what the Australian government doing is seen as being better than nothing. So as I say, the tech companies are kind of being put on notice, and so they're responding to this. And the response that they're using is going straight to the tobacco playbook. I mentioned earlier it was developed by Hill and Knowlton in the 1950s to work with the large tobacco companies who wanted to discredit the science that was behind the anti-smoking campaigns. So creation of doubt, that's what we're talking about here today. So what we can see here is Sunita Bose, who's the managing director of Digital Industry Group, which I'll get to in a minute. She's making a little statement to the media about what she sees as one of the main problems with the legislation in Australia.
There is a risk as we look to ban younger adolescents from these mainstream services. We're actually pushing them to less safe, less regulated parts of the internet where they don't have those guardrails that exist on mainstream platforms and where young people may be less willing to seek help.
So what we can see here is, following on from that, let's see who Sunita Bose is. So I went to her LinkedIn page, and we see that she's the managing director of a company called Digi. So what is Digi? Digi is the Digital Industry Group, and Digi is the industry association for companies that invest in online safety, privacy, cybersecurity, and thriving Australian digital economy. So this sounds really anodyne. It sounds like they're doing stuff to try to help people in the online world. But really, one of their main activities, if you will, is, it's in the small print in their website, is it's becoming an advocate. It's a lobbyist for the large online companies. So here you can see it on the screen, companies like eBay, like Google, like Pinterest, like Facebook, like Twitter, like Snapchat. All of these companies are being represented in Australia, their interests in Australia are being represented by Digi. So rather than necessarily being somebody who's concerned about online safety, what they're actually trying to do is to protect the rights, if you will, and the freedoms the industry has. So the Digital Industry Group is a not-for-profit industry association advocating for the digital industry in Australia. And again, they're talking about investing in online safety, privacy, cybersecurity, etc. But really what they're doing is actually protecting the interest. And one of the ways they're doing it is by creating doubt. And what we saw or heard in the clip that we played earlier from the way that the association was representing the argument and suggesting that if there's a wide-scale ban on under 16s accessing social media, they'll just go to other forms of communication on the internet that aren't as regulated as the large platforms are. So one of the things the company talks about is responsibility. It talks about openness. It talks about education, so digital education, educating people how to act online. Talk about collaboration between partners online, with government. It's talking about online safety codes, and it's talking about creation of a disinformation code. So the company is presenting itself, and Sunita Bose is presenting herself as somebody who's advocating for all of these things: openness, transparency, online safety. But in reality, what her company is doing is it's enacting the playbook tactics from the tobacco industry to create doubt. So the Australian government says there are real concerns around online safety and security, and we haven't got all the answers, but we're doing something about it. And Sunita Bose, who's the voice of these large tech companies, is trying to create an argument, trying to create a controversy around one very small aspect of what is happening. So moving on from that, slipping back to the UK, in this case now looking at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. They work to protect citizens in the UK from what's going on in the online world. And they've been very active over the last few years in creating legislation. They created something called Age Check, which is a standard technical requirements for data protection and privacy. So social media platforms have to check the age of the people who are creating accounts to make sure that they're complying with the social media platforms' regulations around trying to restrict youth's access to content and to various platforms. And the reason that we're talking about this is because these initiatives were created by Baroness Kidron, who's a campaigner for children's digital rights in the UK. She's in the House of Lords on the Digital Technologies Committee, and she's become a voice of reason that people around the world are listening to. Governments around the world are listening to and looking at the work that she's doing. And this is what she has to say about what Sunita Bose said in terms of children, in response to the ban in Australia, about children going to other parts of the internet for communication and for entertainment.
One of the things the industry always does is cast doubt. They used to cast doubt about age assurance. They now start casting doubt about what children will do. I think we should be much harsher with them and say, what are you going to do to create the kinds of spaces and places that we want children to be?
So what she's saying there is that the tech companies, rather than trying to nitpick in the argument, rather than trying to create doubt around the science behind the concerns that parents and governments have around social media platforms, what she's trying to say to them is, you should get your house in order. You're the people who should be coming up with the proposals to create a safe space that we want our children to exist in. So what she's done in that very simple statement is she's exposed the PR tactic created by Hill and Knowlton for the tobacco industry in the 1950s. And she's showing that Sunita Bose casting doubt is on one facet of an argument rather than addressing the whole issue. What she's doing is she's trying to focus attention on a very small part, and in that she's trying to create a debate as to whether access to social media apps is harmful to youth by suggesting they'll go somewhere else to dark places that are unregulated and from where there's no help being provided to them. So she's picking on this one small aspect and trying to undermine the whole thesis behind the work that the Australian government is doing here. And she's suggesting that Meta and the companies that she's representing are trying to manage the process when in fact they're trying to delay process. And she's trying to promote this notion of a controversy in the debate around the negative impacts that social media has, so that people think that there are two opposing sides in the discussion rather than there being a body of evidence to support the fact that something has to be done because of the negative impact of social media on young kids. And ultimately what she's trying to do is, the industry knows that something's coming their way, and they're trying to delay that hitting them. They're trying to delay these regulations coming into place to put them within a framework. And what's really interesting to note is to look at what happened in the 2024 election in the United States, where the majority of the large tech companies gave large donations to the Republican Party. And one of the reasons they did that is that the Republican Party is against regulation. It's pro-deregulation. So what the tech companies want in having a Republican in the White House for the next 4 years is that they want regulation to be lifted on their activities. They don't want regulation to be imposed. So if the United States is becoming protectionist about itself and its economic activity, it's going to be protective towards the tech platforms, the Metas, the X's of this world. And it'll slow down any regulatory frameworks being put in place to regulate what these companies are doing, which is why it's interesting to see what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Australia, what's happening in the United Kingdom to regulate these industries to try to protect youth. So what I've tried to do here is to expose, if you will, how Sunita Bose, who's doing her job, she's a lobbyist, she's an advocate for tech industry, but she presents herself as somebody who's working in the digital field to try to protect people when that's not her real mission. So she's doing her job. And if you go to her LinkedIn page, what you can see is that she's promoting articles by scientists, by professors working in various fields who are challenging the law that's just been put in place in Australia. So she's finding scientists who have different opinions to the ones that are mainstream, and she's promoting their work to try to create this notion that there is a real debate about whether social media has negative impacts on youth or not. So it's kind of interesting to see these tactics playing out 70 years after they were first created by Hill and Knowlton. And this is what we see in climate change, in the whole science around climate change as well. So ironically, I put here, Digi complained to the Australian government that the legislation was moving too fast. It was put in place too fast. Proper consultation hadn't taken place with all of the people that should be listened to in the discussion. And this is really funny, given that Mark Zuckerberg's motto for Facebook between 2008 and 2014 was move fast and break things. So now the government's moving fast and trying to break the control that the tech companies have. They have control on the market, but they have no accountability. And so the government's trying to do something about that, to move fast and break that stranglehold that they have. And Facebook's now complaining, which is kind of ironic. Anyhow, on that point, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for joining me for this session. And I look forward to seeing you for the next one. Take care.